just finished this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who spent the war years at Nazi concentration camps. As a prisoner, he experienced the ultimate suffering during the Second World War. This is an inside story of a concentration camp told by one of its survivors. And not just any survivor, a psychiatrist. And a psychiatrist who personally has faced such extremity is the one worth listening to. When the Second World War started, Frankl was a professor and psychiatrist living in Vienna. Because of their Jewish identity, he and his whole family, including his pregnant wife, got arrested by Nazis and sent to concentration camp. Frankl spent the war years at different camps, including the famous Auschwitz extermination camp with several gas chambers. He describes in detail the harsh conditions of the camps and the mental state of people, from the prisoners to Nazi guards. Viktor himself was lucky and was one of the few to survive. But when he got out at the end of the war, his wife, his father, his mother, and his brother were all dead. He decided to spend the rest of his life teaching to other people that are struggling with life what he had learned during the worst of times, that people can and must find meaning in their lives. The purpose of this book is to help people to find meaning in their lives. Frankl tells the story of his and others' suffering to provide a first-hand account of the thoughts and behaviors a person goes through when confronted with such misery. He says that in concentration camps, prisoners did all they could to stay alive, from deadening emotions like anger, to trying to retain a sense of humor about their situation, to shaving with broken glass, so as to look younger and therefore be less likely to be sent to gas chambers. But to survive physically, Frankl argues, it wasn't enough. And not everyone in the camp survived mentally. He describes some prisoners who gave up and killed themselves, and gives examples of people who lost hope and could not find meaning in the suffering of the concentration camp and ultimately gave in to death. He says that suicide was commonly considered by prisoners, and a typical way to do this was by running into the electrical wire fence. And yet Frankl argues that despite the worst conditions in the camp, some prisoners rose above their suffering and continued to treat other prisoners with compassion. They exercised the little freedom they had within themselves and adjusted their attitude toward their suffering, even if they weren't able to eliminate the root of that suffering. While surviving the camp was largely a matter of luck, Frankl writes that those who were able to keep themselves going without committing suicide or choosing to waste away tended to be the ones who had something to live for, a higher purpose. He argues that those who dedicate their lives to something can face any pain or hardship and still keep going. So here is the first takeaway from this book. He who has a why can bear anyhow. The thing that kept Frankl going was the hope of seeing his wife and the hope of writing this book. The story that Frankl telling us about camp life is to show us that even in the most terrible circumstances, a person still has the freedom to choose how they see their circumstances and create meaning out of them. Frankl discovered a truth, a final wisdom by so many thinkers while in concentration camp. And this is our second takeaway from this book. Forces beyond your control can take away everything you possess except one thing: your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. You cannot always control what happens to you in your life, but you can always control what you will feel and do about what happens to you. While in concentration camp, Frankl went through a lot of suffering, and he argues that suffering is an incredible part of life, and without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. This is clearly depicted in the story of Jesus' crucifixion. The way a man takes up God's cross gives him a simple opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning in his life. This is the third takeaway from this book. For life to have meaning, there must be meaning in suffering. Frank notes that only a few prisoners were able to do this and find meaning in their suffering. But those few are sufficient proof that this can keep you going, despite the terrible suffering that people were faced in those camps. Frank then goes on to argue the meaning of life. He says that life is full of problems, and to truly live means to take the responsibility to find the right answers to the problems that life throws at us, and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each person. Everyone's lives is different, and there is no general definition of what life is supposed to mean. Frank says that during camp life, he learned that it does not matter what we expect from life, but rather what life expects from us. And this is the fourth takeaway from this book. Frank says that man's main concern is not to gain pleasure or to avoid pain, but rather to see a meaning in his life. He says that meaning is possible in spite of suffering, and to suffer is not heroic and not necessary in order to find meaning in life. But when confronted with suffering, you can find some meaning in it, such as the meaning of sacrifice. In some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment that we find meaning in it. And this is our last takeaway from this book. When we are no longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Frank witnessed the absolute worst side of humankind, but by changing his attitude, he found meaning in his suffering. As horrible the circumstances were, Frank realized that he was free because he could decide how he would think and react. Frank did not have the power to walk away from the camp, so he decided to master it. If you are going through difficult times in your life and are struggling to find meaning in life, this book is a must read for you. This is one of my top books I've read so far, and I would strongly recommend you to read it. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Make sure to like the video. It helps a lot, and subscribe for more summaries in future. Thank you.